And one. Hello, all, and welcome to the Fantasy and Sci-Fi Fanatics podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Coolbaugh. Today, I had me a very special guest, Ben Schenkman. How are you doing today, Ben?
I'm doing fantastic, Dan.
I love anytime I get somebody that emails me and is like, "Hey, these are my books, these are my products," and then, like I said before we got recording, I was just like, I was really busy at that time. I was like, "Oh, I'm just gonna look," and I went and checked out, book one, and I was just like, "It's such a cool cover." The title had me. I looked at the blurb. I think I got back to you within about 3 minutes. I was like, "Yeah, we got to have an interview." Like, so it sounded really cool. So I am really, really, really excited to talk to you about your books and your writing journey today. So thank you so much for coming on today, Ben.
Yeah, thanks. I'm very happy to be here.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we're going to get started with that first question. What has your writing journey been like up until this point?
Yeah, it's interesting because my journey is has been fairly interrupted. This first book, I started writing this book. It's been long enough since I worked there that I don't think anyone can get me in trouble for it. So I was writing this book at work, uh, probably in 2006. So
Mm,
like it's been more than a minute. and uh and so like I was in what I felt like was kind of a dead end job at the time, and I know I don't want to dive too deep into it because we'll get into it a little bit later, but uh, I started writing this book with this concept, and then I stopped for a while, and then I didn't pick it up again until National Novel Writing Month in 2014. So 2014 from 2006, and I wrote the first draft, and I was pretty happy with it. And I had it professionally edited, and I started sending out some queries because I decided at that point, uh, self-publishing I think didn't have the all of the acceptance that it has now.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so you decide that you're going to go through the hazing ritual that is traditional publishing, and I didn't get any positive feedback. I didn't get any feedback, frankly, and then I shelved it, you know, until now. It's probably about a year and a half ago, and I was on TikTok of all places, and one of my favorite creators that reads terrible prose written by men. I don't know if you follow
yeah. Yeah. The
Atomic
good
Apple
ones.
Pie.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So she was reading terrible writing written by men, and like, no offense, we're men. I don't take it personally because there's a lot of bad books where men are trying to write women, and they
yeah.
don't do the job.
Some of my own, yeah.
I wouldn't say that. So I said to myself, I wrote a book, and it can't be nearly as bad as any of this,
It's fair.
and these are published.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
like I dusted it off, and I did some rewrites, got some beta readers, and eventually published it. But I published it in December, just at the end of last year in December. I participated in National Novel Writing Month 2023, and I wrote 60,000 words of the sequel.
wow.
So it took me, let's assume 2014 was the date. It took me almost 10 years to get the first book out, but I wrote the second one in a month, basically, like
Oh,
a month and a half. So since then, it's just been like, I mean, like, I'm neurodivergent, so it's become a bit of a hyperfixation of mine. So I'm spending a lot of time. I've got other things going on, but like I try to spend at least some time every day writing. So like my writing journey has been long but interrupted, but now I'm like really getting more deeply into it.
yeah, yeah. Well, that's awesome. You just mentioned something, sorry, that I definitely want to touch on because
Yeah.
um so a lot of people I've just noticed this recently, which makes me feel better. It's not just me. So like my first fantasy I'm still working on, and I know why now because I have my novella and I'm like, people are like, oh, you gotta fix these things. I'm like, oh, so that's what I didn't like about my fantasy, but my fantasy took like, ooh, same thing. I think I was 14, and then I was like kind of going with some ideas. I think I was like 21, about to be 37 next month. So, it's taken a long time, but once I got to my novella, it took about a year and a half. But now I'm working on stuff, but like I'm working on like I call it like a fantasy. I have a dark fantasy based off of our D&D campaign that we used to do a
Yeah.
couple years ago. And it's, I have a lot of things to fix still, but it's so much easier to get the words down, right? Um, and I just want to mention that a lot of people they get discouraged when they've written something or rewritten something for that long of time. But I kind of picture it almost like you're going up a mountain, and you're like laying that groundwork and foundation, not just for the one book, but for the fact that, all the books that come after. So it's not just that one book that, it's taking you since 2014, it's like it's really, just building up your abilities, to that certain point. So, and then I've seen a lot of people, like you just said, where they've really gone up to that cliff that they've made and they're able to just hop, and all of a sudden everything, it doesn't ever, I don't think it's ever easy, right? Stephen King's like, still struggling with the same stuff, but it is easier, right? So I just want to mention to people if you're in that boat, like, like us, right, where you've been working on something for over 10 years, like, don't get discouraged. There's, first of all, there's a reason, right? That's a story that needs to come out of you. And then somebody's most likely, if that's the case and you're a reader, right? Someone's going to want to read that. So I just think that's really cool because I've noticed that for, for quite a few authors and writers that that's been the thing. So I think that's really awesome. And I like that you stuck with it too. It's always those stories that, that stick with people. I've had people be like, oh, shelve this, whatever. I just want to mention again to people in the audience, Kelly McCullough came on here, did the Fallen Blade series. That first book, he actually had written it a different way, came on, got like published for Webmage with the series. Then they were like his publisher, it was like Ace or whoever, I forget, but they're like, oh, we want something else. And he's like, oh, I got this story. And he almost, that's back in the day where he was writing, everybody's writing stuff. He almost, got rid of it. And that ended up being one of my favorite series of all time. So I just want to point out to people, and he's like, that's the story that stuck with me and took me over 16, 17 years, to publish. So I think that's really cool. So I just want to point that out to the audience. Um, that kind of leads us into our next question, though, directly there about what genre or genres do you currently write in and why?
Yeah, so I'm urban fantasy, or I guess we'll call it contemporary fantasy because urban fantasy doesn't sell as well as contemporary fantasy does these days. I don't know. It's confusing.
It
Um,
really is.
yeah, so I write primarily in urban fantasy, and ironically, so I'm going to liken myself to Stephen King, not in writing, but in that I've picked a place. So like Stephen King's got Maine. His books happen in Maine. That's
Yep.
what they do. I lived and went to college in New Haven, Connecticut. I used to live
That's
in
cool.
Connecticut, and I live in Massachusetts now, so I'm not very far.
Oh, you're gonna have, sorry, real quick before I forget, remind me, you have to join our East Coast Avengers group
Oh
that I've
yeah,
formed, where we will be all joining together. Anybody out there that's on the East Coast author wise, we're gonna join together and then go to different cons and stuff together. So, because
yeah.
I'm in Central New York, so
Oh,
you're not
okay.
that far from me. So if we meet like
Yeah,
halfway somewhere, it'll be cool. But anyways,
100%. I'm in. So New Haven, Connecticut is my place. It's an old stomping grounds for me, and it's also very it's it's like I always likened it to being Connecticut's New York City. It's got a lot going on. Uh, whatever food you want is there.
oh, cool.
It's got it's got two universities. One is a state university. One is Yale. So it's got the Ivy League nonsense, and it's just a great setting. And I wrote my first book based in New Haven, and so the series now is based in New Haven. So my urban setting is New Haven, Connecticut. Ironically, for the future projects that I'm working on, my current plan is to still have them be in New Haven. It's just they're in a different urban fantasy world based in the same
Oh,
physical
that's
place.
cool. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
So, why do I write urban fantasy? I like the idea of magic being part of the real world. I was one of those geeks back in the day that wished that I could be taken from my mundane existence and dropped into some high fantasy world, but in the end, I moved away a bit from epic fantasy into, yeah, but like there's magic in the world right now. One of my favorite authors and my newest project, which I'll talk about later, is loosely inspired by Charles DeLint,
cool.
who's a fantastic urban fantasy author out of Canada, and all of his books take place in a made-up city called Newford.
Hmm.
And it blends. It's like a blend of Fey mythology and indigenous, like
Oh, that's
Algonquin
cool.
stuff. And he was just a really big inspiration for me. It's definitely magic exists as an overlay of the world, and it's just kind of there for people who can see it.
That's
So that kind of thing really inspired me to write more in urban fantasy.
Yeah. Well, I just think it's cool, first of all, because you and I are both doing like urban fantasy, right? And but it's interesting because, and I love urban fantasy because of this, because you and I can both coexist within the main genre of urban fantasy. Whereas like I was talking to one of my author friends, like Logan D. Irons, he goes, I think you're kind of leaning more towards military fantasy with the subgenre. But it's kind of interesting, right? Was I never thought of that. My character's a Marine, but I never thought of that. But when I was checking out, your blurb and everything for your book, I'm like, it just made me so happy that urban fantasy is so cool because, and that you did this because I've always wanted to write death as a character
Hmm.
and being like an everyday guy and not knowing, and him being kind of like fed up you know, with being death, right? The Grim Reaper, and his name's Ben Grimm. Sorry, Fantastic Four, but like through the book one, I wanted to do like how he rediscovers himself, but then, ends up doing something, and I'm like, oh, I don't, the only thing I could find was like True Blood, kind of that
Yeah.
kind of match. So it just makes me feel better because I'm like, oh, Ben did this, with this type of urban fantasy. So it gives me confidence, that I could one day, put that story out, and still be totally different than my other one, but still be an urban fantasy and make a really cool story. So I just want to point out to the audience that, just because it's, your urban fantasy, you don't have to be like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, right? There's all sorts
Right.
of things you can do. So, and I'm glad you mentioned like Charles too. Yeah, I talked to Charles at some point. He's on my list for TBR. My friend just sent me one of his books. But there's just so many cool things you can do, like you were saying with urban fantasy. So it makes it really fun. But now I really want to get into, because we talked about genre, talked about your background, but now I'm really, really interested in that third question on what the books are actually about. So what are your books? My Boss is the Devil, and then book two, Dueling Shoulder Angels, which is just a cool title. And I love the covers. The designer in me loves the covers, like absolutely. Those are amazing. I'm so happy that you showed book two, Dueling Shoulder Angels, because that's just a really cool cover. So I'm just curious at what the books are about and really like how you came up with this idea.
Yeah, so again, I started writing the first book back when I was in my own like dead end job. So the basic premise came, well, it wasn't, it's not a portal fantasy where you get sucked into the new world, but it's like, what if this mythical figure showed up and offered me a job? Like what would happen there? But of course, I've always been kind of uh, a sarcastic person that wants to subvert expectations. So the character in the book that is Lucifer isn't the devil you'd expect. So, and to be fair, I wrote this book well before Lucifer, the TV series, came out. So,
That's a good one, yeah.
yeah. So the book number one, My Boss is the Devil. And by the way, the name of the series is The Devil You Know. Uh,
Cool.
and so book one is really about Nick in his dead end life ta taking a gamble because, and I'm not really spoiling anything that's happens in the first few chapters, but Nick, our main character, working as a barista, gets an opportunity to take a test drive to go work for the devil, but the devil doesn't want him to be an anti-hero or do bad things. The devil wants to give him an opportunity to help people, which is like his secret desire. And the book is really just about that. It's about, do the ends justify the means? What is evil really, and is evil more about people and what we do to each other than it is about any mythical hell that we would end up in? So it kind of takes the traditional idea of deals with the devil, where your soul ends up in torment, and turns it on its head, and that it's going to be different than that. So I think that's really the thrust of the book is Nick's journey through this this deal working for Lucifer.
That's really cool. And then I know it's hard, right? To it's hard to talk about book two without, spoiling parts of book one. But in terms of dueling shoulder angels, can you tell us a little bit about what that one's about if it doesn't spoil things or
Yeah, sure. That's actually it's interesting because the progression of the books, and I can talk about this because this is just like setup stuff. So in book one, we've got Nick and we've got Lucifer, right? And then that's the main story. There are a number of supporting characters. One of the supporting characters in book one is Amy, a goth witch. Uh, Totally not based on anyone in real life, like people that I've known in my past or my partner right now. So Amy's a supporting character in book one. So book two, and forgive the draft, the proof
it's
stripe.
awesome.
So book two, which also entertainingly enough, we call this Millennial Couch Green,
I love that.
because
That's
we
awesome.
there may or may not be a green velvet couch in my partner's space that is this color. So in book two, we continue the story of Nick, but we also have a much bigger role for Amy,
Oh,
who's
cool.
also on the cover, but we also introduce a different part of the mythos with
Oh,
with
cool.
so if you think about it, the dueling shoulder angels is you've got the angel and the devil on one shoulder. So dueling shoulder angels goes deeper into establishing not just not just the bad place, but also the other side.
Oh, that's cool. Oh, that's super cool.
Yeah, and also I'll say the way that the books progress, because I have a third book that's been drafted. It's currently in editing. The first book has one point of view. It's Nick. It's urban fantasy is usually written first person POV.
Yep.
Book two, uh, and I can't say why or when, but book two introduces a second POV. If you like strong written woman characters, I think it's for your listeners because that's our supporting character from book one becomes more of a secondary main character in book two.
Oh, that's awesome.
And then in book three, we're expanding to, and this is the most I will ever do in a book. We expand to three POVs,
Oh, that's cool.
but it's a
Yeah, I'm crazy
progression.
about
Yeah.
it. That's super cool. Sorry, you got a lot of really cool things there. So I want to go back to my first question that I think it would be the most helpful for me and our audience. When it comes to up to like the angel too for book two, when it came to like Lucifer in particular, right? And, you
Mhm.
said right, which I think is cool, is that you said you started this before the TV show came out. But I think it's great that you published after because now you have two audiences. Me, I'm like, yeah, I like the show and everything, but I'll just read it because it's urban fantasy. But you have other people that might actually read it because they like the show. So I think that's really cool. But the show has done something different with Lucifer. So I just want to know though, like how you took this mythological character with a lot of connotations from a lot of different people, not just Christianity, but like a lot of different people. A lot of people don't even know that like Lucifer and the devil and Satan are usually like actually different like entities in terms of root mythology. So
It
kind of how
it
did you kind of go
it
and how'd you sift through that to come up with one character that fit your world and your like your story, if that makes sense?
so for the root mythology, I went with that. Lucifer is an angel cast down from heaven, but then is the devil. So like in this root mythology, they're the same character. Because depending on who you talk to, like Lucifer was cast out and then became Satan. So it's one of those things where it's multiple names for the same character. But names matter to an extent as far as like
Mhm.
the personalities that you get. The premise that I went on was what if Lucifer and what if hell are mostly just misunderstood? Like
Yeah.
what if the place and the person is it's less about fire and brimstone and more about tallies on if different sides of the ledger. in that you're going to end up in one of those two places, and they care which one you end up in, but it isn't necessarily because one you're going to suffer for eternity and one that you're not. So again, I don't want to get too deep into it because it explains it in
Yeah,
book
yeah, yeah.
one, but but it's definitely more along the lines of Lucifer is just a god-ish level mythology figure that wants to take custody of souls.
That's interesting. I really like that because I teach history, and I have been discussing this the last 2 years, since I had met somebody who like studies a lot of like ancient Greek mythology and stuff and like primary sources. And I thought it was so interesting that, her and I were discussing how Hades is actually misunderstood a lot, and like why. So I've been talking about that with my students, like, or even like Shiva, right, the destroyer. So talking about how like why are all the gods and goddesses of death always, who are in control of where you go, right? And she's like, he's not really in control of where you go. Like Hades is just there, right? Just in charge. And I just thought that was really interesting concept. So I kind of like how you did that because that's kind of like what her and I've been discussing, with Hades. And I asked my kids, like, so why don't people like Hades? They're like, well, he represents death. I'm like, oh, he's just in charge of the area. He doesn't kill you, right? Other things kill you, so it just gets a bad connotation. So, and he just kind of misunderstood. I don't know. And then I kind of liked how Rick Riordan did that, right? With Hades as the character. It's because that's kind of how it is, right? And how he's represented. But I think that's really cool because you go with a different theme, and all of a sudden that adds a whole different context to the character, which I think for you ends up making it really, really cool, to be able to do different things and to come up with different storylines, which is why I think people like Lucifer the TV show so much because it was, kind of a different take on same old for him. So I think that's really, really cool. Um, can we assume that you have done something similar with the angel in book two, and kind of diverted expectation a little there to write a more unique character for a more unique story? Does that make sense?
Yes. Uh, I can't give too much away because it
Yeah,
is
yeah,
really
yeah, yeah.
a spoiler, but I will say so for one of my early readers for book two, uh, it they basically so it's not an angel as much as it is God, so there's that. And one of my early readers basically said that the book two is now their favorite Pride Month read,
Oh, that's cool.
for various reasons, including something having to do with the representation of God as a character.
Oh,
So
cool.
I'll just say like you know that God's going to show up, or at least an angel will. They are not going to be what you expect.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Which I think is fair. It's always so funny to me, uh, it's always interesting to me because people like I'm Catholic or Christian, I don't know, whatever. But like people always ask me things. I'm like, I always say like, I'm more of a spiritual person, I think, than religious. Because like being a historian, it's kind of hard because like you see how society and context have done things, right? And one of my female students last year, she goes, why is God always a guy? And I'm like, well, why do you think? She goes, well, all these societies are patriarchal. I go, kind of crazy, right? She goes, and then there's this whole thing with the Trinity and stuff. She goes, so if God can be more than one person, can't God be more than one gender? Or does God not have a gender? I go, I don't know. She goes, kind of interesting. So I always think it's interesting when people like to break down the mythos, because and like I talk about Plato and Aristotle yesterday, we were talking about, and it's basically like Aristotle's like, well, can you entertain a thought without, believing it? So I just always love that, and I always love urban fantasy because it makes you, I think, entertain thoughts like Constantine, right? With how like the angels were, and then I think like the Supernatural TV show too, right? Subverted expectations. You're like, oh, like what if, and I don't know. I always like things like that because it just makes you think things, from a different perspective.
Mhm.
If that makes sense. So I think that's cool though, because I feel like that's what you're doing, with the series. So I think that's really cool. Sounds awesome. I'm really excited for book one. You're actually on my list of five. I haven't gotten paid yet this summer, so I
I
had
was like,
to
just
had to behave.
I'll send you a copy.
Oh, I appreciate it. I had to behave. My wife's like, oh, I was like, she's like, what are you doing the other day? I was just like scrolling through my list of five. I was like, I'm just waiting to get paid. They wait so long to pay us in the summer, for summer school and stuff. It's kind of crazy. But I'm really excited though, because I'm really excited to see as a reader what you do with the script. I'm really excited as a writer to see like how how you handle things. So I feel it's cool to. I've actually liked interviewing authors before I read their books. Now people think I'm crazy, but what's nice is I get to talk to you ahead of time. I feel like it's almost like the director's cut as I'm reading now and listening. So for me, I always get way more out of reading as the reader and as the writer now. So I don't know, it's kind of cool. It's like a nice little thing that only I know. I keep talking about with people. Um, what is it about Nick that made you want to write him as your main character? Like in terms of starting with him, like what was it about him that you're like, I have to write this first POV from this character, and like what was it about him that really made him fit the story? I guess is what I want to know.
Something about my main character and characters in general. I don't go heavy into describing characters because in some ways, especially for first person point of view, I want people to be able to see themselves in the character. So like, if the person reading the book is black and I describe my character as white, I've immediately
Yep.
divorced this character from their own personal experience. Like in my head, is Nick a white guy? I mean, when I'm writing it, maybe he is because he's effectively he not all main characters are a self-insert, but like Nick is a little bit of a self-insert. We can't as authors help but put pieces of ourselves into our
Yep.
MCs. Even the bad evil ones. Like if you were writing as an anti-hero, there would still be, or even a villain, there's still a spark of you that's in this
Yeah.
character. So I had to write Nick because in some ways I was Nick, but in some ways we're all Nick. We're all
Oh,
in
I
a
like that.
situation that we want to get out of. Uh, whether or not we're happy in the majority of our lives, I would bet that nearly everyone who is listening to and watching this has a situation that they would like to escape. It could even just be a small one. And so we're all Nick. We all want something better or different or more exciting or whatever. And so I had to write from that perspective because this is the person that we want to see get a chance to change his life. And that's the whole point of it. The whole point of the book is what if I could make what if I could make a difference? What if I could change my life by choosing something that is uh, subjectively, by many people's account, evil,
Mm.
and but then do good with it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So Nick was just like I could have called him anything. And actually, I had one person ask if Nick was an intentional choice because Old Nick is like a moniker for Satan. Uh,
Oh, I never even thought of that. That's interesting.
Neither had I. It is not intentional, but it is
That's
now. You
cool.
know,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You're like you go back now in interviews, you're like,
it's
yeah,
like,
I
oh
totally.
yeah, totally. I totally meant to do that.
That's
Um,
really funny.
So yeah,
True.
Nick is a bit of an everyman, and that he's all of us who've worked a dead end job. You may not have made coffee, but maybe you bagged groceries or worked as a cashier or worked retail or food service and even if you're not doing that now, you remember what that was like.
Yeah, yeah. No, for sure. I like how you said like we were all Nick or we're all Nick. I like that. I
Yeah.
think that's totally true. So yeah, I definitely remember like my kids always ask me things at school and stuff, and I'll tell them straight up. I'm like, I used to wash dishes, I used to serve, I used to be a busboy, I used to be a janitor, I used to be, like a detail guy. I was like the lowest one at like a dealership. I used to be a porter at a dealership my dad worked at. Like, think of any just like I used to tear out stuff for installations for my mom and just do like manual labor. I mean, they're like, why do you want to do this and this? I'm like, I never want to do those again. Like I did for a little bit, for my second master's. I went back and bartending and stuff for a little bit, but I never want to go back. So I write anytime I can between, what I'm doing with my job life and my son. Yeah, so I totally feel you there. I think that you hit a really cool theme there. But I want to go back though to something cool that you said because when you're talking about, this theme of, something that's supposed to be bad or evil, but then be able to do good with it. I just love that as a theme, because I don't know. I kind of have a, I don't want to give anything away, but I have a kind of like a similar theme or things that'll happen in my urban fantasy series where I like to do the same thing, like subvert with a theme and then make you think. I don't know if it's the teacher in me or what. I think the greatest books I've ever read have made me rethink something, like, oh, I thought these were the bad guys, thought these were the good guys, and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, maybe both sides are wrong kind of thing. I don't know. So I just think that's really cool that you kind of embedded that into these books and are trying to help people discover that a little bit, because I think that's our world we live in, right? United States could be politics, could be like foreign affairs, and everybody has a particular idea on who's good or bad and stuff. And I always think back to when my dad and I were watching like a Civil War movie, and I asked him, like, I remember being like 10, I'm like, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys? He's like, neither. He goes, slavery was bad. And he's like, both sides are just trying to do, X, Y, and Z. And then as an adult, actually studying things, I'm like, man, that was probably one of the most profound things he ever taught me, is that there's multiple perspectives. This thing is bad, but at the end of the day, it's like people are trying to, do what they think is right. And or stop the person doing what they think is wrong. So I think as a writer, it's like it's really cool that you're able to, kind of take that and kind of build even multiple themes into that. So that's really, really cool. I'm kind of curious of what like your main goal with the world building within the first book was, in terms of like setting up kind of like the rest of the thoughts, or opening yourself up to, new stories, like book 2 and 3.
Yeah, so my books have been some people think that my books are on the cozier side of urban fantasy. It's not a cozy book. Like bad things happen, there are stakes, but the stakes are like personal stakes, not
Mm.
world-ending stakes, or at least
Yeah.
for book one, that's the majority of it. The stakes ramp up as you get through books two and three, but most of what I did for world building setup was to introduce you to New Haven, Connecticut, how this guy fits in with it, and then making sure you understand that the supernatural is mixed in with the mundane. It
Yeah.
isn't it's like low fantasy versus high fantasy. Like high fantasy magic is everywhere. Low fantasy, like your average person doesn't maybe even know that magic exists, and magic is just kind of like this rare thing. Um, I've sometimes called my fantasy like like low magic urban fantasy, and that
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
the supernatural exists, magic exists, but it's not accessed by everyone or even a lot of people. So most of the world is just the world, and this is just kind of sideways to it. So book one is mostly just the setup for that. So my book is actually in the self-published fantasy blog off 10 like this
Oh,
year.
cool.
And one of the other authors who was doing like first chapter reads mentioned in his first chapter read of my book, like, so we don't actually get introduced to anything supernatural in chapter one, but I don't mind that. Like he basically said, like the writing was very smooth, and he did not like the fact that there was no magic in chapter one did not bother him at all. So it's a little bit of a slower ramp up than people might be used to, but once it kicks into gear, it kicks into gear. And then again, books two and three are more heavily immediately into the action, because book one is there's a lot of not a lot of, but there's more setup. The books aren't very long. Like book one's 236 pages, so it's like a popcorn read.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, but yeah, most of the setup is just building the setting, introducing the characters because it's a very character driven book, and then placing them and slowly introducing the twists of the supernatural and how it affects their lives.
Oh, that's cool. So you said something that I'm kind of curious about. So I'm glad you mentioned, like chapter one. So I've had some rearranging. So I think I'm gonna put I was too worried about not putting a supernatural thing that happens at the beginning of my prequel novella, because it is urban fantasy, right? But that kind of makes me feel better because I've been told by feedback like, hey, you should actually be like military action first and then kind of go in. So it actually makes me feel better that somebody has said that, that like, they really liked chapter one, and that didn't bother them, if that makes sense. So kind of makes me feel good as an author because I feel like for me as a writer, like it helps my overall story. So, but that's what I'm always worried about is like, if I entered this contest or if I just give this to readers, my readers are saying that they think that would be better. But but, I always question myself with that. So just saying, having you say that actually really makes me feel better. Because we have to, right, really think about, okay, it's great to get people's attention, but then you have to be able to maintain it, right? And I think if it doesn't fit for your story, it's okay, right? To do that with that slow burn. So yeah, I think that makes total sense.
So, I mean, genre, this is about whether or not you're writing a story as it is, or are you writing a story to fit the genre?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, because again, if I was writing a story to the genre, even for urban fantasy, I'd be writing a clone of Harry Dresden. Like he'd be slinging spells and like and all sorts of stuff, and it's just not that, because that wasn't the story that I wanted to tell. So for in your books, your character is a Marine, and if there's action later in the book, people might think, oh, why didn't we start with this? But that's because like that's what their expectations are of that kind
Yeah,
of
yeah,
character. If your intention of that Marine isn't to immediately show him involved in violence or action, like that's okay. It depends on what the message is. What's the
yeah,
theme?
yeah,
Is the theme doing extraordinary things for whatever, or is your theme this person's personal journey from having gotten out to getting back in? Like if they're supposed to be out at the beginning, they can't be holding a gun to someone's head in the beginning, because then that isn't the story.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it makes total sense. No, it's cool. I also think it's interesting as indie authors in particular to where we can decide that, right? Like I can decide that I'm gonna totally rearrange things or whatever. I don't know. And the subgenres really I think now are cooler because even within the last 3 years, right, the subgenres, have changed a lot and really just help you out. But I think that again, it goes back to world building, right? And like what you were saying is, you had a particular type of story in mind, something you were trying to do. So, but I just think it's cool. I just want to point out to the audience, it's cool because I think, you went confidently with like, yeah, this is where my story starts, and this is how, this is like whether you want to call it a slow burn or, the pacing. I just think it's good because, again, as indie authors, I definitely have to listen to your beta readers and people that are helping you. But I think it's cool because, we get to decide that. And I think that's what for me ends up making indie books really fun. I think they have a different pacing than, a lot of traditional published books. I think now a lot of traditional published books and, urban fantasy, sci-fi, things like that, fantasy, regular fantasy, whatever. I think they're kind of shifting that way, right? Where now the starts are pacing, things are kind of looking more similar, like they used to. But I don't know. I feel like it's cool because indie, I think, really set the pace for different things like that. But it's nice because we get that ability to choose. So I think that's really cool. I always love this question. So, who do you think your most difficult character to write was and why?
So I'll tell you and this is more for book two than book one, but what I'll the characters that I agonize the most over writing well are women, because I am not one.
Fair.
And the challenge is, and again, like this is because I've seen men eviscerated for writing women badly. And the thing that I didn't want to do was to do that, because
Mhm.
I mean, like, you know, in a, I don't want to sound like, I don't want to get too much into it, but like I've there are books that all men should read, like the Will to Change by Bell Hooks, other like uh, literature that is focused on introducing men to feminism and what we can do to help
Yeah, for
with
sure.
that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
And and I have read enough and consumed enough of that content that the very last thing I wanted to do was make my women stereotypes, or make my men stereotypes in how they treat women. So
Yeah,
like
well, that's a good point.
if
Yeah.
if you pay attention throughout my books, even the first one, and I wrote most of the first one back in 2014, um, things like, my main character does not assume that women are into him. Like that's just not a thing that he does. Whereas like many other people will write their MC as God's gift to women, and they're all going to be attracted to him, and that's just kind of a trope. And like, I don't do that because I want my male MC to be realistic and part of current culture. But then I also want to write the women well, in that they are independent characters who have their own interests and motivations that aren't just, just in support of the MC. And like, yeah, in the first book, Amy is more of a supporting character, so has less of her own arc. But in book two, where she has a stronger role, I had to make sure that I was handling that well enough that A, she didn't just read like, Nick with a wig on,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and and then secondly that she had her own personality and and interests and motivations. um so yeah, I think that's the stuff that I agonize the most about. And like, luckily I have a number of women in my life that would kick me in the teeth if I wrote women badly. So as far as I'm concerned, I at least passed that litmus test. Whether my readers enjoy the way that I write women, that's up to them. But like, I also try for a fair amount of representation as well. So that's the other thing is, how do you write representation woven into your book without just making it a hammer that you're beating people with?
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
And that same person who said that book two was their new favorite Pride Month read said that the way that I interwove representation as stuff that just existed, um, helped me know that at least for them, I hit the nail on the head, and that it's I used a soft enough touch that I built it into part of the world and the characters, instead of saying, you know, it's not, well, this character is gay and a positive representation of gay people. No, the characters just, what one or more of the characters is just
Yeah,
gay.
yeah.
It's just
Yes.
who he is, and that's it. Like, we don't get into why, because it doesn't matter why. um, so I feel like those are the things that I've worried about the most.
Well, first of all, I just have to say, like Steven Erickson, I told you what you're saying. Steven Erickson, I think I was surprised with how old a lot of his books were, right? But like, I'm like, my buddy and I, we're like going through it. And my friend's like, I had no idea that he did such a great job representing like LGBTQ. He's like, I've never heard of that. And I said, I haven't either. And we were going through, and it was like, I thought he did such a great job with Malazan Book of the Fallen, because it's literally just like ours. It's just part of the world, right? And like, he'll mention different things, but it's not like there's no token characters for anything like that. Same with women. I think the story's great now, but he doesn't get enough credit, I don't think, for and even Esselma, his co-creator too for the world, and then kind of has his own books in it. Does like things similar, but Steven, though, more in his, just does a really great job of representing everyone. And again, like just making everything just like ours, just like a part of the world, just like people are people. So I just ended up liking that, I think, more than like the books themselves, if that makes sense. But I was surprised because I was like, nobody has mentioned that. It's just great. Nobody ever talks about that. So it's kind of crazy to me. So I totally get what you're saying. It's we had a question pop up in my podcast group on Facebook where somebody had said, like a writer said, an author said, like they're writing, somebody said, oh, it feels like a token character. And it was, I think it was somebody who was neurodivergent, and um and I'm like, well, and people were like, putting their opinions and stuff, and it came out, the person's like, I kind of feel like I accidentally made them a token character, and I was trying to actually make them, like a character, like with equal stakes and this and that. So they ended up rewriting, and by all accounts did a much better job. But I think it's important to know that, right? I always think about that because my second prequel novella, I'm introducing just the most amazing, like, female character that I've ever written, and you kind of get the tagline for her. So I had people that were like, "You really want her in novella one?" I'm like, "I'm sorry, she's in novella two," because it's really like about her journey, and my main character for the series really ends up. That's where you get that, that split off, because book two. So I think it's always interesting to, yeah, to try to do those characters really well, right? Because that's what you're trying to do. But sometimes, maybe we need help with that. So I think it's good that you ask for help, I think, is what I also want to say to the audience. So, but people can definitely feel, right, when you're just writing a token character versus actually trying to give, a character their dues. So I think that's really smart on your part, but that's really cool. If you could study under one author of all time, who would it be and what would you want to study in particular from them?
Uh, I've thought about this question, and I don't even know that I have an answer. I've read a lot. I mean, like I can see the books behind you. Like we read a lot of books, and I at this point I don't know. Um, I mean, I would say right now, like I'm already writing my new concept, and
Oh, cool.
it's loosely inspired by Charles DeLint's work. So I would
Oh,
probably
cool.
say him for right
Yeah,
now.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, because I really loved the way that he melded the indigenous
Mm,
culture, spirituality, mythology into his writing. Um, and I can give a little bit of a blurb later as far as like what the new project is, but um, so for right now, I would say him. But like, there are so many amazing authors
yeah.
that I would love uh, to study under. Though at the same time, like, this is gonna sound so weird, but like as a dad with a full time job and like more hobbies that I can count, I'm like, I don't have time to study under anyone.
So true.
So like if they were giving me like an artist residency where I could just go study with this author and like everything else was taken care of, then sure, I would go work with maybe Charles DeLint for a little while. I don't know, maybe Jim Butcher,
Yeah, it's a good one.
because I really liked his books also, even though even my new concept, which is more traditional urban fantasy, is still not a Jim Butcher novel, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I do think it's really difficult, like you said, because there's just so many good people. Like when I was giving that question, I thought of it last night. I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting question. I was based off of a conversation I was having with a friend 2 days ago, and like there's like H.M. Long. I've had her on here twice, and the way that her prose is, I mean, you just feel the world seeping through the book. And it's so cool. And to write a fantasy like she does would just be like, it's so hard because, and people tell me like, you're being too informative, you need to be more descriptive, which I totally agree with them. But like somebody like Hannah, I'm like, oh, I like, might ask her for some help on a couple of, small sections or something because I know she's busy. But just yeah, it's hard, right? But then there's like somebody like Anthony Ryan who writes amazing short novellas based off of some of his series. The Seven Swords is amazing. I recommend everybody to go check it out. Talk about world building. This guy writes 99-page books, and there's more world building coming off and seeping off those pages than some people write, 1,100 pages. I mean, just like absolutely amazing. So I totally agree with you. It gets kind of difficult, but
Can I talk about world building for a
oh,
second?
please,
Because
please.
that, so I'm going to express a pet peeve of mine. Um, I hate being world builded at in the beginning of a book. Like the
Oh,
one
yeah, yeah, yeah.
thing that I don't want is I don't want chapters of exposition explaining your world. And like in the new book that I'm writing, I'm currently fighting that in that I have a bit of a magic system. It's not complex, but it's more complex than so the current series, The Devil You Know. I have if you think about like the quadrants of magic system, I would be in the soft and nebulous magic system, and that magic happens, but it's not necessarily well explained. There's logic, but my magic is more akin to variations on contract law than it is about like fireballs.
Oh, that's cool.
Um, but in my new book, there's more just direct application of magic, so it's getting more specific. And the way that I like world building to happen is you learn what you need when you need it.
Yep.
So like a conversation is happening and then there's a brief pause to dive one or two paragraphs into the thing that you need to know right now and gets back to the conversation. So it's like it breaks it up into digestible chunks,
Yeah, yeah.
so that like you don't get the fullness of the world until frankly the book is over.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that's currently what I'm trying to do with my new book, but it's a challenge because world building it's tough because people need to know these things.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
but you can't just like put a funnel in their mouths and like start pouring the world directly into it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that's what I like about Anthony Ryan's like novellas is like he doesn't do that. Like he say like you said, I like how you mentioned that, like how you put that. But like that's what he does is like he just gives you a little bit, a little bit. And I picture it almost like layering, but like
Yep.
some people do like boards, right, where it's still almost too much. He layers up like little leaves
Yeah.
in between, different things. And I'm just like I just want to like figure out how he sets that, if that makes sense. Like in his head, and it's kind of like just sprinkling, right? Just a little bit of salt here, a little bit of pepper here, to get that perfect recipe. So yeah, I definitely think that's the best way to do it. But so I want to make sure you got enough time for this last one because I always love to help people out to, talk about current projects and things. So you have any updates, news, or current projects like that you can share with us?
I have so much.
That's
Uh,
awesome.
okay,
That's an
so
easy answer.
so the first two books, My Boss is the Devil and Dueling Shoulder Angels, are out. They're available on Amazon in the usual formats: ebook, paperback, hardcover. I am currently recording my own audiobooks.
Oh, that's awesome.
So I am 75% of the way through the raw recording of book one,
Oh, cool.
and with just a little bit of sentimentality because like I've you know how you don't realize your motivations for something until suddenly you do, and I kept agonizing over whether to do the audiobook myself. Like I'm an actor, I do voices and accents, uh but I'm not a professional audiobook narrator or producer. So I got a bunch of auditions for book one, and I like there was nothing that I was in love with. And at the same time, I kept thinking about my mom, who isn't in particularly great health, and she at this point can't really like read like written word. So what I wanted to be able to do was for her to hear my books. Like
Oh, that's cool.
I've read book one to her, like a draft of it back in the day, but but I want her to be able to hear the finished product,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then I want her to be able to listen to books two and book three, and I ideally would like her to be able to hear them in my voice.
Oh, that's really cool.
So I'm currently recording those. So book one, hopefully in the next month or two, the audiobook for book one will be out, and then I'll follow on with book two. Book three, the current title of book three is Too Many Gods in the Kitchen.
Oh, that's awesome.
Which by the way, you mentioned Shiva earlier. It's not Shiva, but book three moves outside of the Abrahamic
Oh,
religions
cool.
and
Oh, really
starts
cool.
introducing something else.
Oh, that's really neat.
And I think it's really fun. So book three should be out by early October, I would expect. And then I'm currently writing one new project. The working title of it is Let Sleeping Gods Lie.
Oh, I like that title.
And it is a more traditional urban fantasy in that it's going to be a little more action packed. But the way that I describe it is Harry Dresden meets Lee Bardugo's Ninth House with a sprinkling of Indiana Jones.
That's cool.
So it's effectively an urban fantasy with a main character who's a bit of a conservationist, and cares about the urban spiritual landscape, and it's at odds with the like stuff happening in the more thickly urban setting. It's hard to not get too into it, but it's effectively that's the concept. It has a focus on indigenous mythology and concepts, so it's very animist. Thinking
Cool.
again back to the influence being Charles DeLint.
Oh, that's awesome.
So that I'm currently writing, I'm like almost 5,000 words in, and my books usually run about 80K. So like I'm not doing too bad.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And I have one more concept after that, that once this is done, I'm gonna write that. There's potential for a series in this book, but I'm gonna be writing this one as a standalone to start
Oh, cool.
and kind of see how it goes. Like if the reception to it is good, I may come up with more. But then
Yeah,
I
yeah.
have another concept. So I'm culturally I'm Jewish, and the newest concept that I haven't done anything other than write some notes on is focused on Jewish mysticism,
Oh,
and
cool.
so it's an urban fantasy with it'll be with a Jewish main character, and that's the focus for the magic system.
Oh, that's really cool. I loved how Kevin Hearn did did his. It was it was really interesting. It was really really cool. He had some very interesting characters come in. Yeah, it was really neat. If you haven't checked him out yet, really cool. Iron Drew Chronicles. But he did a great job bringing in some characters from that vein. It was really
Oh,
awesome. It really
yeah,
made
I'll have to
me.
check it out.
Yeah, I like was looking into a lot of different stuff after that. I was like, oh, it was really really cool.
Um,
Let's. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, what one more thing. So I wrote a short story like prequel
Oh, that's cool.
for book one. So My Boss is the Devil now has a an intro. It's a short story. It's called The Thief of Joy.
Oh, that's awesome.
And it's from it's funny. I've introduced a character in this short story that now I'm tempted to write like a full prequel about.
That's awesome. That's how it
But
usually goes.
it introduces how Nick got to being a barista
Okay.
with a little spice from the devil. Um, so it's pretty short, but it's an entertaining read. It will be available if you sign up for my newsletter on my website, benschenkman.com, and you'll get a copy of The Thief of Joy.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, that sounds really cool. I have to check that out. I always love prequel, if it's short stories or novellas. I'm just a sucker for them. So that's why I'm writing like three. So I definitely caught me there. So I just want to remind our audience that, make sure that you're reviewing any products, whether they're Ben's or any of our authors or creators. That's been our main thing for the last two seasons, and that just continues to be the thing that helps people out the most. But other than that, Ben, thank you so much for coming. Like we told you earlier, all of the, description links and everything will be right down below. So you guys can find all of Ben's links right there. If you're new, that's where to go. If you have been here a while, you know the drill. But Ben, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been awesome talking to you. I'm really glad that, we're able to connect, and I'm really looking forward to My Boss is the Devil. So I really can't wait to do that. And always read and then review my books. So I'm actually starting reviews right after our episode airs, actually, with season four. So as soon as I can get book one done, I will do that review and we'll do a little video. I'll send it to you and the blog post, and we can share that and hopefully help you out as much as we can. Send me anything you got, for book two and three and anything else you got, and I will share it as much as possible, and I will get everything out into the world as much as I can. But thank you so much for coming on today, and thank you so much for reaching out, and it's been great. I look forward to talking to you, in the future for more of your books and having you on again in the, in maybe season four. That'd be really awesome. So
Thanks, Dan. I had a fantastic time.
awesome. Well, Ben, thank you so much. I hope you have a good rest of the day, and I will be talking to you shortly. I'll send you an email and we'll get things going for you.
Sounds great.
See you later, bud. I'll talk to you.